January 17, 1940. The morning mist clung to the slopes of the Obersalzberg like a shroud. Inside the Berghof, Adolf Hitler stood before a wall-sized map of Europe, his fingers tracing the Atlantic coastline with the precision of a man who believed destiny itself bent to his will. The room smelled of fresh coffee and wood smoke from the stone fireplace. Outside, snow fell in silence, blanketing the mountains in white, the same color as the marble busts of Roman emperors that lined the Great Hall. Hitler turned to his assembled generals, his voice low but certain. "America," he said, dismissing the notion with a flick of his wrist, "is a nation of mongrels and merchants. They have no discipline, no will. They are soft from luxury, corrupted by jazz and Hollywood fantasies." The men around him nodded. It was not merely opinion, it was doctrine, woven into the very fabric of National Socialist ideology. The United States, in Hitler's view, was a contradiction, industrially powerful, yet spiritually bankrupt, a land where democracy had degenerated into chaos, where individualism had dissolved the bonds of blood and soil that gave a nation true strength. He saw a country addicted to comfort, a people incapable of sacrifice, a military force that would crumble at the first taste of real war. This was not unique to Hitler. Across the Atlantic and Pacific, in Tokyo's war rooms and Berlin's Reich Chancellery, the Axis powers shared a fundamental miscalculation. They believed American affluence equaled weakness, that a society built on freedom and abundance could not produce warriors capable of enduring the crucible of total war. They were wrong. But understanding how they were wrong, and why, requires stepping back into the ideological landscape of the 1930s, a world where totalitarian powers looked at democratic capitalism with contempt. To Hitler, the United States was a living insult to his vision of order.
Its people were a racial hodgepodge, its culture a vulgar cacophony, its politics a circus of competing interests. How could such a nation, he reasoned, field an army that could stand against the Wehrmacht, the most disciplined and technologically advanced fighting force the world had ever seen? The German military tradition stretched back to Frederick the Great, through the Prussian reforms, through the iron discipline of the Kaiser's armies. German soldiers were trained to obey without question, to subsume individual will into the collective might of the Volk. They were schooled in hardship from youth, their bodies and minds tempered by a culture that glorified sacrifice and scorned softness. America, by contrast, seemed to glorify the opposite. Its soldiers came from a land of plenty, where even the poor had access to luxuries unimaginable in the bombed-out cities of Europe. They grew up with automobiles, refrigerators, radios in every home. They went to high schools and colleges, not military academies. They listened to swing music, watched Betty Grable movies, ate ice cream and hamburgers. They were volunteers and draftees, not products of a rigid caste system. They questioned orders, talked back to officers, complained about the food. To the German high command, this was proof of decadence. An army, they believed, reflected the society that produced it. A soft society would produce soft soldiers. But discipline is not the same as rigidity, and abundance, it would turn out, was not the same as weakness. When the first American troops began arriving in Britain in early 1942, German intelligence officers studied them with a mixture of curiosity and disdain. Reports filtered back to Berlin describing young men in ill-fitting uniforms, lacking the parade ground precision of German or British formations. They seemed casual, almost careless in their bearing. They chewed gum, smoked casually, and moved with a relaxed confidence that the Germans mistook for sloppiness. Intercepted letters from German soldiers stationed in occupied France reinforced the stereotype. "The Americans are like children playing at war," one wrote home. "They bring candy bars and phonographs to the front. They do not understand the seriousness of battle." The Japanese held similar views, though their contempt was rooted in different cultural soil. Bushido, the way of the warrior, demanded absolute obedience, self-sacrifice unto death, and a spiritual purity that Western materialism could never achieve. To Japanese commanders, American soldiers were spiritually hollow, motivated not by honor, but by the base desire for comfort and survival. The Battle of Bataan had seemingly confirmed this. American and Filipino forces, starved and exhausted, had surrendered by the thousands. Japanese propaganda seized on this, portraying Americans as lacking the will to endure suffering. How could a nation that valued individual life above collective glory ever produce soldiers willing to die for their country? Yet beneath this Axis narrative lay a dangerous blindness, a failure to understand that discipline in war is not merely about obedience, it is about adaptability, initiative, and the capacity to function under chaos. The German and Japanese militaries were in many ways victims of their own success. Their rigid hierarchies, while effective in the early blitzkrieg campaigns, created systems where junior officers and enlisted men were discouraged from thinking independently. Orders flowed from the top down, and deviation was punished. This worked brilliantly when plans unfolded as expected, but war is entropy. War is the domain of friction and fog, where no plan survives contact with the enemy.
And it was here, in the brutal proving grounds of North Africa, Italy, France, and the Pacific, that American discipline, fluid, pragmatic, and rooted in individual competence, would reveal itself as superior. The Germans first encountered this in Tunisia in the winter and spring of 1943. The Afrika Korps, battered but still dangerous under Erwin Rommel's command, clashed with American forces in the mountainous terrain near Kasserine Pass. The initial engagement seemed to confirm German assumptions. American units, green and untested, were routed. Tanks were abandoned. Soldiers fled in disarray. Rommel himself remarked that the Americans fought bravely as individuals, but poorly as units, lacking coordination and tactical sense. Berlin celebrated the victory as evidence of American incompetence. But Rommel, unlike many of his peers, was a realist. He saw something in the wreckage of Kasserine that trembled him, the sheer volume of American equipment. Abandoned tanks, trucks, artillery pieces, all of it modern, well-made, and abundant. Even in defeat, the Americans seemed to have an endless supply of materiel. More concerning, they learned quickly. Within weeks, American forces reorganized under new leadership. General George S. Patton arrived, a man whose understanding of discipline was not rooted in parade ground rigidity, but in aggressive, relentless action. He demanded speed, initiative, and a willingness to take calculated risks. Under his command, American forces struck back with a ferocity that stunned the Germans. At El Getar, American infantry and armor held their ground against German counterattacks, displaying not just courage but coordination. Rommel noted in his private diary, "The Americans have improved remarkably in a short time." What Rommel observed was not a transformation so much as a revelation.
American soldiers had always possessed the raw material for excellence: intelligence, mechanical aptitude, physical fitness, and a cultural disposition toward problem solving. What they lacked initially was experience, but the American military system, unlike its Axis counterparts, was designed to learn. After-action reports were compiled and disseminated. Tactics were debated and refined. Commanders who failed were replaced without sentiment. The same decentralized, questioning culture that Hitler saw as a weakness became a strength. American sergeants and lieutenants, educated in civilian life and trained to think independently, adapted to battlefield conditions faster than their rigidly trained German counterparts. By the time American forces landed at Normandy on June 6, 1944, the notion of American decadence had become a bitter joke among German veterans. The soldiers who stormed Omaha Beach did so under withering fire from entrenched positions, crossing obstacles designed to rip apart any assault. They died by the hundreds in the surf and sand. Yet those who survived pressed forward with a grim determination that shattered German morale. Interviews with captured Wehrmacht soldiers after D-Day reveal a recurring theme: shock at American resilience. "We thought they would break and run," one prisoner told his interrogators, "but they kept coming. Even when we killed them, more came. They had so many men, so many machines." The ocean, an apt metaphor for what American industrial and logistical might brought to the battlefield. While German soldiers rationed ammunition and scrounged for fuel, American units operated with a level of material support that seemed almost obscene. Every American infantry division was supported by a logistical tail that included trucks, repair depots, field hospitals, and supply dumps stocked with everything from artillery shells to cigarettes.
German soldiers, hardened by years of brutal fighting on the Eastern Front,
were stunned to discover that American GIs received hot meals, mail from home, and even ice cream, sometimes within miles of the front lines. One German officer, captured near St. Lo in July 1944, described his astonishment in a letter later published in a German POW camp newspaper. "Their soldiers eat better than our generals. They waste ammunition as if it costs nothing. Every man has a rifle that works, boots that fit, a raincoat. We have been told they are soft, yet they fight all day and still have the strength to joke and smoke their cigarettes as if war is merely an inconvenience. This is not softness." That strength was rooted in abundance, yes, but also in the democratic ethos that abundance made possible. American soldiers were not cogs in a machine, expected to die without question for a mystical ideal of nationhood. They were citizens in uniform, individuals who had chosen, or been drafted into, service but retained their sense of self. This created a paradox that totalitarian systems could not comprehend. American soldiers fought not because they were compelled to, but because they chose to. They believed, often imperfectly and with plenty of cynicism, in the principles their nation represented: freedom, opportunity, the idea that a person's worth was not determined by birth or blood, but by their actions and character. This belief manifested in unexpected ways on the battlefield. American soldiers were notorious for questioning orders they saw as stupid or suicidal, but once convinced of a plan's necessity, they executed it with ferocity. They formed bonds across ethnic and regional lines, Italian Americans and Irish Americans and farm boys from Kansas fighting side by side, their differences subsumed into a shared identity. They improvised solutions to tactical problems with a creativity that baffled their enemies.
When German hedgerow defenses in Normandy stalled the Allied advance, an American sergeant named Curtis G. Cullen welded scrap metal to the front of Sherman tanks, creating makeshift plows that ripped through the hedges. Within days, the innovation spread across the entire army. German commanders, accustomed to waiting for orders from higher headquarters, could not understand how such changes happened so quickly. The answer was simple. American discipline was not about obedience, it was about effectiveness. It was about giving intelligent, educated men the tools and freedom to solve problems, then trusting them to do so. This was the discipline of a democracy, messy, argumentative, but ultimately more resilient than the brittle rigidity of fascism. Nowhere was this more evident than in the Pacific Theater, where American forces faced an enemy even more ideologically opposed to their way of life. The Japanese military, steeped in the code of Bushido, viewed surrender as the ultimate disgrace. Soldiers were expected to fight to the death, and often did, launching suicidal banzai charges or choosing ritual suicide over capture. To the Japanese command, this willingness to die was the ultimate form of discipline, proof of spiritual superiority over the materialistic Americans. Yet, as the war ground on from Guadalcanal to Iwo Jima to Okinawa, that supposed superiority proved hollow. American Marines, many of them teenagers from farms and factories, endured conditions as hellish as any in human history: jungles infested with disease, volcanic islands turned into moonscapes by artillery, weeks of combat without rest. They did not fight with suicidal fervor. They fought with grim professionalism, using firepower, maneuver, and combined arms tactics to systematically destroy Japanese positions. When Japanese soldiers charged with bayonets screaming in the night, American units held their positions and mowed them down with machine gun fire.
When Japanese pilots flew kamikaze missions, crashing planes into American ships, the Navy responded not with despair, but with improved anti-aircraft systems and damage control procedures that saved vessels other navies would have lost. A recurring symbol emerges from the accounts of Pacific War veterans, both American and Japanese: the K-ration. This small, waxed cardboard box, containing canned meat, crackers, chocolate, and instant coffee, became a physical representation of the gulf between the two sides. American soldiers complained about K-rations endlessly. They were bland, repetitive, and a poor substitute for real food. Yet to Japanese soldiers, starving in jungle bunkers on islands cut off from supply, the K-ration was a symbol of almost incomprehensible wealth. Captured Japanese diaries describe the awe and bitterness felt when discovering American positions littered with discarded ration boxes, half-eaten cans of food thrown away as if they were worthless. "We fight on handfuls of rice and the memory of honor," one Japanese soldier wrote in his diary, recovered after his death on Saipan. "They fight on chocolate and canned beef, and still they call themselves warriors." The question haunted the Japanese command. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, had studied in America and understood the nation's industrial capacity. He had famously warned that Japan could win battles for 6 months to a year, but could not win a prolonged war against American production. His superiors ignored him, believing that Japanese spirit would overcome American materiel. Yamamoto knew better. He had seen the factories of Detroit, the shipyards of California, the farms of the Midwest. He understood that America's abundance was not a sign of decadence, but of power. The power to sustain a global war on multiple fronts, to replace losses faster than the enemy could inflict them, and to do so while maintaining a standard of living for its soldiers that no other nation could match. By 1945, the evidence was irrefutable. American forces had liberated France, crossed the Rhine, and were closing in on Berlin from the west, while Soviet armies advanced from the east. In the Pacific, American submarines had strangled Japan's merchant fleet, cutting off the home islands from raw materials and food. American bombers, flying from bases in the Marianas, reduced Japanese cities to ash. And still, American soldiers were better fed, better equipped, and better cared for than their enemies. The K ration, that humble cardboard box, became a symbol of a larger truth. A nation that could afford to feed its soldiers 3 meals a day in the middle of a jungle or a desert, that could deliver mail from home to the front lines, that could provide medical care sophisticated enough to save limbs and lives that other armies would have written off. Such a nation was not decadent. It was dominant. The final proof came not in a single battle, but in the sustained operational tempo that only the American military could maintain. German commanders, schooled in the art of the tactical offensive, excelled at short, sharp campaigns, blitzkrieg, lightning war. But sustaining operations over months and years across thousands of miles required a different kind of discipline. Logistical discipline, the unglamorous work of supply chains and maintenance schedules and transportation networks. The American military, drawing on a civilian economy built around mass production and efficient distribution, mastered this. While German tanks sat idle for lack of fuel and spare parts, American armor rolled forward.
While Japanese soldiers starved on bypassed islands, American bases in the Pacific operated with clockwork efficiency, processing millions of tons of supplies. This was the discipline Hitler could not see, the discipline of engineers and truck drivers, of quartermaster sergeants and dock workers, of a society that had learned to organize complexity on a continental scale. The same systems that delivered milk to every grocery store in America, that built highways and railroads across mountains and deserts, that electrified rural farmhouses. Those systems, militarized, became the logistical backbone of the most powerful armed forces the world had ever known. German soldiers retreating through France in the summer of 1944 saw this firsthand. Columns of American trucks stretched to the horizon, bringing forward ammunition, fuel, and reinforcements. Overhead, transport planes flew supplies to advancing units, bypassing roads altogether. Captured Wehrmacht officers, taken to POW camps in the American rear, were stunned by what they saw. Entire cities of tents and prefabricated buildings, stocked with medical supplies, food, and equipment. "This is not an army," one German general uttered. He was right, and that was precisely the point. American discipline was not the discipline of a military caste imposed from above on a subjugated population. It was the discipline of a free people who had chosen to mobilize their entire society for a common purpose. Factories that once made automobiles now produced tanks and aircraft. Women who had been homemakers became welders and riveters. Scientists who had pursued academic research turned their minds to radar, encryption, and atomic physics. This was not done at gunpoint or through ideological indoctrination. It was done because Americans, for all their flaws and contradictions, believed in the cause. That belief, more than any weapon or tactic, was what the Axis powers could not overcome.
They had built their societies on the idea that strength came from unity imposed by force, from the suppression of individual will in favor of collective destiny. But force, it turned out, was brittle. When German soldiers realized their leaders had lied to them, that the war was lost, many simply gave up. When Japanese officers ordered their men to die in hopeless charges, some obeyed out of conditioning, but others, in the privacy of their own thoughts, questioned the purpose of such sacrifice. Totalitarianism, for all its spectacle and terror, could not sustain morale in the face of prolonged defeat. Democracy, for all its messiness and inefficiency, could. American soldiers fought not because they worshipped their leaders or fetishized death, but because they wanted to go home, and they understood that the only way home was through Berlin and Tokyo. This was a rational, almost transactional form of discipline, devoid of mysticism. It lacked the aesthetic appeal of goose-stepping parades or kamikaze sacrifices, but it worked. It worked in the frozen forests of the Ardennes, where American troops held the line during the Battle of the Bulge, despite being surrounded and outnumbered. It worked in the mud and rain of Italy, where they ground forward through fortified mountains for 2 years. It worked on the black sand beaches of Iwo Jima, where Marines fought for every yard of volcanic rock, not because they loved death, but because they loved life, and were willing to risk it to preserve a world where life had meaning. The transformation in German and Japanese perception of American soldiers was complete by war's end. The contempt of 1940 had given way to grudging respect, then to something approaching awe. In the ruins of Berlin, as Soviet and American forces met at the Elbe River, German civilians begged to surrender to the Americans, knowing that American occupation, whatever its hardships, would be preferable to Soviet revenge.
In Japan, after the atomic bombs fell and Emperor Hirohito announced surrender, there was widespread fear of what the American conquerors would do, followed by astonishment when American soldiers distributed food to starving Japanese civilians, when American engineers helped rebuild infrastructure, when General Douglas MacArthur oversaw a transition to democracy rather than a campaign of retribution. The occupations themselves became a final lesson in discipline. American forces, which had fought with savage intensity when necessary, now demonstrated the discipline of restraint. They did not rape and pillage, as occupying armies had done throughout history. They did not impose a puppet regime or extract crushing reparations. Instead, they invested in the rebuilding of their former enemies, implementing the Marshall Plan in Europe and similar reforms in Japan. This was not softness, it was strategic discipline, a recognition that lasting peace required more than military victory. It required the transformation of defeated enemies into prosperous democratic allies. And so the wheel turned. The nations that had dismissed America as decadent, that had believed abundance and democracy were weaknesses, found themselves dependent on American generosity for their survival and reconstruction. German children who had been taught to despise American mongrels now lined up for Hershey bars handed out by black GIs. Japanese workers, who had been indoctrinated to view Americans as spiritually bankrupt, labored alongside American advisors to rebuild their shattered economy. The discipline that had dominated the battlefield now shaped the peace. In the decades that followed, historians and veterans from all sides struggled to explain what had happened. How had the Wehrmacht, the most tactically proficient army of the early war, been ground into dust? How had the Japanese, who had conquered half of Asia in a matter of months, been pushed back island by island until their homeland lay in ruins? The answers were complex, involving industrial capacity, strategic errors, and the intervention of the Soviet Union on the Eastern Front. But at the core of every explanation was a truth that Hitler and his allies had refused to accept: that a democracy, far from being weak, could mobilize resources and human will on a scale that totalitarian regimes could never match. That soldiers who fought by choice, who questioned orders and complained about the food, could nevertheless display a discipline in combat that rigid obedience could not replicate. The K ration, that mundane cardboard box,
sits now in museums alongside medals of honor and captured enemy flags. It is a humble artifact, easy to overlook, but it tells a story as profound as any battlefield victory. It speaks to the industrial might that could deliver such rations by the millions to every corner of the globe. It speaks to the logistical genius that ensured no American soldier went hungry, even in the most remote jungle or isolated foxhole. And it speaks most fundamentally to a philosophy of warfare that valued the individual soldier not as an expendable resource, but as a human being whose life and welfare mattered. This was the discipline that Hitler could not comprehend, the discipline that Bushido could not match. It was the discipline of a nation that believed in abundance, not as an end in itself, but as the foundation for a free society. A nation that understood that true strength came not from the suppression of individual will, but from its harnessing, not from rigid obedience, but from intelligent adaptation, not from a cult of death, but from a fierce determination to preserve life and liberty. On battlefields from Normandy to Okinawa, American soldiers proved this truth with their blood and sweat.
They were not supermen, not paragons of virtue, not the heroes of propaganda posters. They were farmers and factory workers, immigrants and sons of immigrants, educated and barely literate, united only by the imperfect ideals of the nation they served. They grumbled about the rain and the cold, about orders that seemed pointless, about officers who didn't know what they were doing. They wrote letters home complaining about the food, the boredom, the fear. And then, when the moment came, they advanced into machine gun fire, because the man next to them was depending on it, because the mission required it, because for all their cynicism, they believed the world would be better if they did. That, in the end, was the discipline that won the war. Not the discipline of the parade ground, but the discipline of free men who chose to stand and fight when it mattered most. Hitler saw America as decadent, a civilization in decline, ripe for conquest. He saw the jazz clubs and movie theaters, the advertisements for Coca-Cola and Lucky Strike cigarettes, and concluded that a people so enamored of pleasure could never endure sacrifice. He was wrong, because he understood neither pleasure nor sacrifice. He did not grasp that a society which valued individual happiness was precisely the society that would fight most fiercely to preserve it. That abundance made possible the logistical systems that would bury his armies in steel and fire. That the very freedoms he despised were the source of a resilience and adaptability his rigid ideology could never produce. The snow that fell on Berchtesgaden in January 1940 has long since melted. The Berghof itself was bombed by the Allies and later demolished. The maps on which Hitler traced his empire have yellowed in archives, relics of ambitions that turned to ash. But the lessons of that war endure, written in the testimony of those who fought it and in the world they shaped through their victory.
Among those lessons is this, that discipline, true discipline, is not found in lockstep obedience or the glorification of death. It is found in the harder, quieter virtues of perseverance, adaptability, and the willingness to endure, not for abstract ideology, but for concrete human connections, for comrades, for family, for the hope of a future worth living. The American soldiers who liberated Europe and defeated Japan carried with them, in their packs and in their hearts, a vision of that future. It was not a perfect vision. America itself was deeply flawed, scarred by racism and inequality, its democracy more aspiration than reality for millions of its own citizens. But it was a vision that, for all its shortcomings, offered something the Axis powers could not, the possibility of change, the promise that tomorrow could be better than today, the radical idea that power should serve the people rather than the people serving power. And so, when the guns finally fell silent and the last surrenders were signed, the world was left to reckon with a new truth. The nation dismissed as decadent had proved itself disciplined beyond measure. The society mocked as chaotic had demonstrated organizational genius. The people scorned as soft had endured hardships and inflicted devastations that brought empires to their knees. They had done so not by abandoning their values, but by embodying them. Not by becoming like their enemies, but by remaining, stubbornly and defiantly, themselves. That, perhaps, is the final symbol. Not a K-ration or a weapon, but the American soldier himself, standing in the ruins of Berlin or the ashes of Tokyo, not as a conqueror drunk on triumph, but as a citizen in uniform, ready to go home. He had seen the darkness at the heart of totalitarianism, had fought against it with every ounce of strength his democracy could muster. And in victory, he offered not vengeance, but the possibility of redemption, not subjugation, but partnership, not an empire built on fear, but an order founded, however imperfectly, on freedom. Hitler saw America as decadent, but decadence, it turned out, was not a nation that produced abundance for its people. Decadence was a nation that squandered its youth in wars of aggression, that built death camps alongside autobahns, that chose the sterile purity of ideology over the messy vitality of human diversity. True discipline was not marching in formation toward extinction. It was building, adapting, enduring, and, when necessary, fighting with the full strength of a free people determined to remain free. That discipline dominated the battlefield, and in doing so, it changed the world.